Space is a vast, silent ocean where the distance between worlds is measured in millions of miles. Chase leaned back in his pilot seat, convinced that a trip to the goddess of love would be a simple vacation. Even at its closest, Venus sits 38 million kilometers away from our home planet. Most of the time, the two planets are separated by a staggering 260 million kilometers. This journey is not a short commute. It is a 3 to 6 month voyage into the unknown. Humans have sent over 40 probes to this world, yet only a handful have survived its embrace. The planet below is the very definition of inhospitable, a furnace wrapped in acid. As the ship approached the upper atmosphere, the reality of the mission finally began to set in. Chase checked his displays, realizing the ship was accelerating far beyond his comfort zone. Rico reminded him that slowing down would require a perfect combination of thrusters and parachutes. Chase boasted about his own skills, claiming he had packed the exterior parachutes perfectly himself. Rico noted that the parachutes had been packed over 100 days ago during the initial launch. With a deep breath, Chase prepared to start the survival clock and make history. The ship slammed into the atmosphere, the sound of rushing air turning into a deafening roar. Outside the ports, the world turned into a chaotic blur of thick, toxic gases. This atmosphere is 96% carbon dioxide, creating a blanket of suffocating density. Superrotation winds at this altitude reached speeds of over 360 kilometers per hour. Chase fought the urge to vomit as the G-forces pinned him against his seat. He screamed for Rico to deploy the parachutes before the ship reached the point of no return. Rico calmly informed him that the parachute deployment had failed due to improper packing. The ground was approaching fast, hidden beneath a haze of orange dust and heat. Brace for impact, the AI commanded as the ship's structural integrity began to fail. The sound of the crash was like a mountain collapsing, followed by a sudden, eerie silence. Chase groaned, his first attempt at landing ending in a literal pile of scrap metal. He realized then that surviving 100 days on this planet would require more than just luck. To survive, he would need to master the secrets of the atmosphere he had just survived. The clouds here are not made of water, but of concentrated sulfuric acid. This yellow mist gives the planet its deceptive, beautiful glow from space. It reminded Chase of the daffodils from his youth, though these flowers would melt his skin. Suddenly, a deep, metallic groaning echoed through the wreckage of his ship. Rico explained that the atmospheric pressure was beginning to crush the reinforced hull. On the surface, the pressure is 92 times higher than it is on Earth. It is the equivalent of being nearly 1 kilometer beneath the ocean's surface. Chase realized the ship was caving harder than his last relationship. He would have to abandon the vessel and face the inferno on foot. As the door opened, a wall of heat hit him like a physical blow. The temperature on the surface averages 475 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to melt lead and turn a human into a charcoal briquette in seconds. Using his experimental suit, Chase took his first monumental step onto the Venusian soil. The suit's cooling systems immediately began to scream in protest against the overwhelming heat. The landing craft detached from the orbital module with a violent mechanical jolt. Chase gripped the armrests of his pilot seat as the craft began to tilt toward the yellow abyss. The initial buffeting of the upper atmosphere shook the ship with increasing ferocity. Rico monitored the external temperature sensors as they spiked into the hundreds of degrees. Plasma began to lick at the edges of the reinforced viewports. Chase shouted over the roar of the atmospheric friction, asking for the status of the heat shield. Rico confirmed that the shield was holding, but the velocity was exceeding safe parameters. A sudden lurch sent Chase's head snapping back against the headrest. It was time to deploy the first stage of the parachute system. The pilot chute shredded instantly under the force of the super rotational winds. Chase cursed his own handiwork, remembering how he had packed the gear in a hurry. Rico attempted to deploy the secondary drogues to stabilize their tumbling descent. The secondary cables snapped with the sound of a gunshot echoing through the hull. Chase manually overridden the controls, trying to fire the descent thrusters early. Rico reported that the thrusters were clogged with atmospheric particulates. The ship plunged into the primary cloud layer, a thick soup of sulfuric acid. Corrosive droplets began to hiss as they made contact with the hot exterior. Chase watched the altimeter spin downward at an impossible rate. Rico suggested the emergency crash protocol, which involved inflating external airbags. Chase hammered the deployment button for the airbags, but the console remained dark. They were now falling through the lower atmosphere, where the air was as thick as water. The ground finally became visible through the haze, a cracked and glowing wasteland. Rico calculated the impact time at less than 15 seconds. Chase pulled his legs in and braced his arms against the seat's frame. The impact was not a soft landing, but a bone-shattering collision with the basaltic plains. Everything went black for Chase as his helmet slammed into the control panel. Seconds later, he woke to the sound of his own heavy breathing and Rico's distorted voice. Rico announced that the hull integrity was compromised by 30%. A high-pitched whistling sound indicated that the crushing outside air was leaking in. Chase scrambled to find the emergency sealant spray among the debris. The heat inside the cabin was rising rapidly, now exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. He found the canister and sprayed a thick foam over the leaking crack. The whistling stopped, but the groaning of the metal hull continued as the pressure mounted. Rico reminded him that they were currently at the bottom of an atmospheric ocean. Chase looked out the main viewport and saw the landing gear had been completely sheared off. They were stuck on the surface with no immediate way to take off again. Chase checked his suit's oxygen levels, realizing he only had a few hours of life support left. He needed to find a way to stabilize the ship's internal environment before the heat cooked him. A massive tremor shook the ground, indicating nearby volcanic activity. Far in the distance, Chase spotted a strange, metallic glint that didn't look like natural rock. Just as he reached for the binoculars, a warning siren blared from the main console. The suit's cooling systems immediately began to scream in protest against the overwhelming heat. The spacecraft's descent began with a violent shudder as it bit into the uppermost layers of the Venusian atmosphere. Inside the cockpit, Chase gripped his controls tightly while the G-force pinned him deep into his pilot's seat. Rico reported that the ship had entered the zone of superrotation, where winds move faster than the planet rotates. Sudden gusts of 360 kilometers per hour slammed into the hull like physical blows from a titan. Chase felt his stomach churn as the ship spun uncontrollably within the relentless atmospheric currents. He struggled to level the craft, fighting the joystick against the sheer power of the super-rotating gales. As the ship stabilized, it plunged into a vast sea of thick, chartreuse-colored clouds. Chase stared out the reinforced viewport at the swirling patterns of sulfur that looked like a toxic masterpiece. He commented to Rico that the clouds looked like a bouquet of daffodils from his allergic childhood. Rico interrupted his nostalgia to remind him that these beautiful clouds were composed entirely of concentrated sulfuric acid. A low, sizzling sound began to emanate from the exterior hull as the acid mist made contact. Chase watched the external camera feeds as the shiny metallic finish of his ship began to dull and pit. He adjusted the thermal shielding, trying to protect the delicate sensors from the corrosive atmosphere. The visibility dropped to near zero as they descended deeper into the heart of the acid banks. Strange, ghostly shapes seemed to form in the mist, flickering past the windows at impossible speeds. Chase complained that the GPS was glitching out due to the intense electromagnetic interference. Rico detected a massive electrical buildup in the clouds directly ahead of their flight path. A sudden flash of purple lightning illuminated the yellow fog, revealing a cavernous vertical tunnel in the clouds. Chase steered the ship toward the opening, hoping for a moment of clearer navigation. Inside the tunnel, the wind died down, but the air pressure began to rise noticeably on the gauges. He noticed strange, oily droplets clinging to the glass that didn't behave like water. These were highly concentrated acid rains that could melt a human in seconds if the glass failed. Chase made a face, thinking about how his commute had turned into a literal acid bath. The ship suddenly dropped 100 meters as it hit a pocket of low-density gas. He scrambled to engage the vertical thrusters to stop the plummet toward the crushing depths. The engines roared to life, pushing back against the gravity and stabilizing their altitude. Chase realized that the higher they stayed, the more beautiful and manageable the planet seemed. He told Rico that they should just stay here and open a floating resort for masochists. Rico reminded him that the mission required a surface landing, regardless of his personal preferences. As they continued their descent, the yellow light began to fade into a dark, oppressive orange. The heat began to radiate through the hull, making the cockpit feel like a preheated oven. He checked the external temperature probe and saw it climbing past 200 degrees Celsius. The super rotational winds returned with a vengeance, shaking the ship with even greater force. A sudden groan of metal echoed through the cabin, sounding like a dying whale. Rico announced that they were approaching the transition layer where the atmosphere becomes a supercritical fluid. Chase felt the controls become heavy and sluggish, as if he were flying through syrup instead of air. The descent was no longer a flight, it was a slow, crushing sink into the abyss. He watched as the hull integrity monitor turned from yellow to a pulsing, dangerous purple. Chase shouted for Rico to deploy the auxiliary stabilizers before the ship turned into a pancake. Just as the stabilizers locked, a massive structural snap echoed from the rear of the vessel. The internal pressure began to rise rapidly, and Chase realized the hull was no longer airtight. The metallic groan of the hull echoed through the cabin like a dying beast. Rico reported that the external pressure had already reached 30 times that of Earth's sea level. Chase watched as a hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the reinforced viewport. The narrator noted that the ship was currently being handled like a cheap soda can in a giant's fist. Chase scrambled to engage the secondary magnetic seals around the primary hatch. A sudden jet of superheated gas hissed into the cabin from a failing seam. The heat inside the cockpit spiked instantly to a blistering 60 degrees Celsius. Rico suggested that structural failure would occur within the next 4 minutes. Chase kicked the malfunctioning navigation console in a fit of helpless rage. The sound of rivets popping out of the walls filled the air like gunfire. He lunged for the emergency survival kit stowed beneath the pilot's seat. The floorboards beneath him groaned and warped under the invisible weight of the planet. Chase struggled to breathe as the oxygen recyclers began to grind to a halt. Rico demanded that Chase initiate the atmospheric equalization protocol immediately. Equalizing would mean letting the toxic Venusian air into the secondary hull layers. He pulled the lever, and a thunderous roar shook the entire vessel. Thick, yellow vapor began to fill the gaps between the inner and outer hulls. The screaming sound of the metal structural stress began to subside slightly. Outside, the clouds were so thick that the ship seemed to be moving through soup. The narrator mentioned that this soup happened to be made of concentrated acid. Chase checked the external sensors to see how deep they had fallen. They were only halfway to the surface, and the pressure was already crushing. He slumped back into his seat as the ship took another violent jolt. Rico calculated a 0% chance of the landing gear deploying correctly. Chase shouted at the AI to find a solution instead of just providing statistics. Rico suggested a full emergency evaluation of the remaining structural integrity. Chase began checking the seals on his own environmental suit. He knew that if the ship failed, his suit would be his only protection for seconds. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, save for the occasional flash of lightning. A small green light on the console indicated that the emergency thrusters were still online. Chase reached out to activate the descent stabilizers. A sudden jolt of electricity arced from the panel into his fingertips. The ship's internal systems were being fried by the intense atmospheric friction. Chase grabbed a manual override tool from the wall rack. He began to manually lock the bulkhead doors to isolate the leaking sections. Through the small porthole, he saw chunks of the outer insulation peeling away. The narrator joked that Chase's 5-star accommodations were quickly becoming a no-star coffin. Rico suddenly announced that the main computer core was overheating. Chase knew he had to reach the surface before the ship completely fell apart. The altimeter dropped below the critical 10-kilometer mark. A massive shockwave hit the ship, throwing Chase forward against the console. The interior lights died completely, leaving him in a terrifying silence. Rico's voice came through his helmet comms, sounding distorted and distant. A deafening crack split the air, and Chase felt the floor vanish beneath his feet as the ship broke in two. The heavy air inside the airlock hissed as the pressure equalized with the crushing weight of the Venusian exterior. Chase adjusted the seals on his reinforced gloves, feeling the suit hum with the initial effort of its cooling units. Rico's voice crackled through the comms, warning that the external temperature had already hit a staggering 475 degrees Celsius. Chase scoffed at the warning, adjusting his camera rig to ensure his followers would get the perfect angle of his first step. With a heavy thud, the outer hatch began to rotate, revealing a landscape that looked like a snapshot of hell. A wall of heat hit the doorway, visibly shimmering as the dense carbon dioxide atmosphere rushed against the ship's interior. The narrator's dry voice reminded Chase that at this temperature, lead would be a puddle at his feet. Chase ignored the commentary and took his first tentative step onto the glowing basaltic rock. The ground felt strangely soft, almost like walking on hot tar due to the extreme thermal stress on the crust.
Within seconds, the suit's internal fans began to scream at maximum RPM, struggling to fight the encroaching thermal energy.
Chase told Rico to pipe down as he attempted to plant a custom influencer flag into the stubborn scorched earth. A sudden alarm chimed in his ear, indicating that the primary coolant loop had reached its critical boiling point. Sweat began to pour down his forehead, stinging his eyes as the internal temperature of the suit spiked to 40 degrees Celsius. He dropped the flag, clutching his chest as he felt the air he was breathing turn from cool to uncomfortably warm. Rico shouted that environmental control failure was imminent and that he needed to return to the ship immediately. Every step back felt like moving through waist-deep water as the 90-bar pressure pushed against his every movement. A loud pop echoed from his backpack and a jet of white steam shot out, signaling a total rupture in the cooling system. Chase fell to one knee, the searing heat of the ground beginning to penetrate even the thick insulation of his leg armor. Rico deployed the ship's emergency tether, a high-strength cable that shot out from the hatch and landed near Chase's hand. He grabbed the line with a shaking hand, his vision starting to blur from the onset of heat stroke. The winch whirred to life, dragging his heavy armored body across the jagged surface toward the safety of the airlock. As he was pulled inside, the automated medical systems immediately began spraying him with a fine mist of liquid nitrogen to lower his body temperature. He lay on the cold floor, gasping for breath, while the narrator joked about how short his epic walk had actually been. Rico calculated that without a massive redesign of the thermal shielding, the surface was essentially a death sentence. Chase realized he had wasted one of his precious lives on a stunt that barely lasted 3 minutes. He looked through the reinforced porthole, watching the swirling yellow clouds and wondering how anyone could ever call this planet Earth's twin. Determined not to fail again, he began pulling up the blueprints for an experimental, high-altitude cooling shroud. Rico reminded him that the materials needed were currently stored in a cargo pod that had detached during the crash landing. To survive the full 100 days, he would have to go back out into that furnace to retrieve his supplies. Suddenly, the ship groaned again, the atmospheric pressure finding a new weak point in the lower hull. Chase scrambled to grab a sealant gun, knowing that even a tiny breach would result in an instant fiery implosion. He reached the buckling panel, his hands shaking as he applied the thick, fast-hardening foam to the seams. The groaning stopped momentarily, but Rico warned that the repair was only a temporary fix for a much larger problem. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant booming thunder through the ship's metallic skin. The narrator remarked that the heat wasn't the only thing Chase had to worry about as the sky began to rain invisible fire. Chase returned to the command center, looking at the time remaining on his 100-day clock with a new sense of grim reality. He realized his ego had almost gotten him killed, and that Venus didn't care about his follower count or his mojo. A strange reading appeared on the long-range scanners, indicating a metallic signature just over the next ridge. Rico identified it as a potential man-made object, possibly an old Soviet lander from decades ago. Just as Chase began to plot a course toward the signal, the ship's internal lights flickered and died, leaving him in total darkness. In the silence that followed, he heard a strange, rhythmic thudding coming from the outer hull, as if something or someone was knocking. In the silence that followed, he heard a strange, rhythmic thudding coming from the outer hull, as if something or someone was knocking. Rico checked the exterior sensors but reported absolutely no biological signatures in the vicinity. Chase realized it was just the metal expanding and contracting under the erratic thermal vents below the ship. He knew he couldn't hide inside forever if he wanted to hit that 100-day milestone. Behold the Mark II Hellwalker suit featuring triple-layered ceramic insulation and a liquid nitrogen cooling loop. This time, the 475-degree heat wouldn't turn him into a human rotisserie chicken. The heavy airlock door hissed open, revealing a world that looked like a blurred watercolor painting. Above him, the sky began to darken as massive, heavy clouds gathered with unnatural speed. These clouds weren't made of water vapor, but of concentrated sulfuric acid. Rico warned that a massive precipitation event was beginning directly overhead. Huge droplets of acid began to fall from the sky, looking like liquid diamonds in the haze. Chase braced for the impact, expecting his new suit to dissolve instantly into a puddle. But as the droplets reached 10 feet above the ground, they suddenly vanished into thin air. He reached out a hand, but the ground remained bone dry and scorching hot. This is the phenomenon of virga, where rain evaporates before it can ever touch the surface. The heat near the ground is so intense that the acid turns back into a toxic gas instantly. Chase laughed, realizing he was being rained on by a storm that didn't technically exist down here. Rico pointed out that while the rain wouldn't melt him, the rising gas was even more corrosive. Small pits began to form on the surface of his shiny new gold-plated boots. He needed to keep moving toward the coordinates Rico had flagged for potential shelter. The landscape was a graveyard of ancient lava flows that had hardened into razor-sharp ridges. Every step felt like walking through deep, hot mud because of the heavy atmospheric density. He spotted a metallic glint in the distance, partially buried under a layer of sulfur dust. It looked like a discarded piece of machinery, but far too old to be his own equipment. He cleared enough debris to reveal a Cyrillic inscription etched into a corroded titanium plate. Rico identified the object as a structural component from a mission launched decades ago. Seeing the remains of human ambition made the environment feel even more lonely and hostile. A sudden booming crack of thunder shook the very ground beneath his boots. Above him, the acid clouds were now glowing with a strange, pulsing violet electricity. Rico screamed through the comms that the static buildup in the atmosphere was reaching critical levels. He needed to find a cave or a natural overhang before he became a lightning rod. The suit's internal temperature began to rise again as the cooling system struggled with the exertion. He spotted a dark opening in the side of a volcanic cliff just a few hundred yards away. The air around him began to hum with a high-pitched electrical drone. A bolt of purple lightning struck a nearby spire, shattering the stone into glowing shards. Chase dove for the cave entrance just as the sky seemed to open up with fury. He rolled into the darkness, the sounds of the surface storm muffled by the thick stone walls. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed the cave walls were covered in a strange, shimmering crystalline growth. This wasn't just a simple cave. It was a geologically active pocket filled with unknown minerals. Suddenly, a low guttural vibration rumbled from the depths of the cave, much deeper than the thunder outside. Rico's sensors picked up a massive heat spike moving rapidly toward them from beneath the floor. He realized too late that this wasn't just a cave, but a dormant vent that was about to wake up. Just as he turned to run back into the lightning storm, the entrance collapsed in a shower of heavy boulders. Trapped between a lightning storm and a waking volcano, Chase finally realized that Venus didn't want him here. In the flickering red light, he saw something moving in the shadows of the deeper tunnel, something that shouldn't exist. Chase moves cautiously through the thick, amber-tinted haze, his boots crunching against the jagged volcanic rock. In the flickering red light, he saw something moving in the shadows of the deeper tunnel, something that shouldn't exist. As he approaches the shape, the metallic glint reveals it is not a creature, but a discarded relic of human history. Resting in the dirt is the mangled but recognizable frame of the Soviet Venera 13 probe, a ghost from the 1980s. Rico explains that this brave little machine survived for only 127 minutes before the planet crushed it. Chase looks down at his own high-tech suit, realizing he has already died more times than the probe did. He circles the artifact, marveling at how the paint has survived the blistering 475-degree heat. Rico notes that this probe sent back the first color images of the surface, showing the world the same hell Chase now walks. Chase decides that such a historic moment deserves a proper tribute for his followers back on Earth. He pulls out a small digital flag and prepares to plant it in the scorched soil next to the Soviet titanium. Above him, the chartreuse clouds begin to swirl with a sudden, violent intensity. The air begins to crackle with static electricity, making the fine hairs on his neck stand up through his suit. Rico issues a sharp warning about an impending atmospheric discharge in the immediate vicinity. Chase scoffs, claiming that a little bit of weather won't stop his greatest photo op yet. A deafening boom echoes through the thick air as the first bolt of purple lightning strikes a nearby spire. The ground trembles beneath his feet as the electrical energy dissipates through the conductive soil. Without warning, a massive bolt of electricity arcs directly from the clouds toward the metallic Venera probe. The strike hits the probe squarely, and the surge of power throws Chase backward into the dust. He lies on his back, his visor displaying a cascade of system error messages and warning lights. Rico's voice crackles through the internal speakers, confirming that Chase has just survived a direct hit. The narrator mocks Chase for thinking that the planet of love wouldn't try to electrocute him. Chase pushes himself up, his suit covered in a fine layer of soot and ash. He looks at the Venera 13 probe and sees that the ancient metal has been partially fused into the rock. Despite the close call, Chase insists on finishing the video for his audience, pointing his camera at the carnage. Rico points out that the lightning storm is not over, and more strikes are forming directly overhead. The ground begins to vibrate again, this time with a deep, rhythmic thrumming from beneath the crust. Rico warns that the lightning has likely triggered a local seismic event in the nearby magma chamber. A massive crack opens in the earth just a few meters away, releasing a jet of superheated gas. Chase realizes that the historical site is about to be reclaimed by the planet's volcanic fury. He scrambles back toward his ship, the heat rising so fast that his suit's cooling system begins to whine in protest. He reaches the airlock just as another bolt of lightning strikes the ground where he was standing seconds ago. Inside the safety of the hull, Chase collapses against the door, gasping for air as it seals shut. Rico informs him that the surface temperature has spiked another 50 degrees due to the volcanic activity. He looks through the reinforced portal at the spot where the Venera probe once sat, now obscured by smoke. He realizes that Venus isn't just a challenge to be conquered, but a graveyard for everything that dares to touch its soil. Chase declares that he cannot stay on the ground any longer if he wants to see Day 100. He asks Rico if there's any place on this entire miserable rock that isn't actively trying to kill him. Rico processes the data and suggests a radical shift in strategy, looking toward the upper atmosphere. Chase looks at the data for the clouds 50 kilometers up, where the pressure and temperature are shockingly Earth-like. Suddenly, the ship's sensors pick up a strange, rhythmic signal coming from deep within the sulfuric clouds above them. The ship's lights flicker, and a low, guttural vibration shakes the hull, but it's not coming from the ground. Through the camera feed, a massive shadow passes over the ship, eclipsing the orange light of the surface fire. The shadow overhead resolves into a massive, roiling wall of superheated dust sweeping across the basalt plains. Rico screams through the comms that the hull integrity is dropping to critical levels as the wind speed triples. Chase hammers the ignition sequence as the ground beneath the landing struts begins to liquefy from the intense pressure. Massive plasma thrusters roar to life, blasting blue fire against the orange sulfurous dust. The ship groans under the weight of an atmosphere 90 times heavier than Earth's as it fights for every inch of altitude. A jagged bolt of purple lightning strikes the primary sensor dish, sending sparks flying across the interior cabin. Rico calculates the optimal buoyancy layer where the pressure and temperature finally mimic those of a spring day on Earth. Chase watches the external thermometer drop from a lethal 400 degrees to a manageable 30 degrees Celsius. He deploys the external gas collection scoops to begin filling the massive internal buoyancy bladders. The ship utilizes the thick carbon dioxide to inflate a series of graphene-reinforced balloons. As the ship levels out at 50 kilometers above the surface, the terrifying heat is replaced by a serene, golden haze. Chase unbuckles his harness for the first time in days and feels the steady, gentle sway of the floating base. Rico remarks that it only took 3 near-death experiences and a destroyed landing gear to find a habitable spot.
Chase begins the deployment of the Cloud City expansion modules, which unfold like a giant metallic flower.
Solar panels extend to catch the unfiltered energy of the sun, powering up the life support systems to full capacity. Looking down, the surface of Venus is hidden by a beautiful, deceptive blanket of swirling cream-colored acid. He steps out onto the exterior observation deck, protected only by a lightweight breathable mask instead of the heavy suit. The winds here are steady, carrying the floating city across the planet at hundreds of miles per hour without a single bump. Chase records a final vlog update, showing off his new permanent home in the most hostile world in the solar system. He realizes that while the surface belongs to the fire, the skies of Venus belong to the pioneers. The floating modules begin to link together, forming the first permanent human outpost in the Venusian atmosphere. Rico initiates the automated gardening system, planting the first seeds in the aeroponic bays. Chase sits in a comfortable chair, watching the sun set over the acid clouds, turning them into a sea of liquid fire. The journey that began with a reckless bet has transformed into a mission for the future of humanity. He logs his final day of the challenge, declaring the mission a success far beyond anyone's expectations. High above the crushing weight and the melting heat, life has found a way to hover in the balance. The 100 days are over, but Chase decides he isn't ready to head back to Earth just yet. He tells Rico to cancel his return flight and order a fresh supply of coffee for the next 6 months. The floating city glows like a lonely star in the dark side of the planet as it rotates into the night. Atmospheric scrubbers hum quietly, turning the toxic air into breathable oxygen for the small crew compartment. Chase lies in his bunk, listening to the soft whistle of the wind against the graphene skin of his home. The data he collected from the Soviet probe is safely backed up, ready to be sent back to the scientists on Earth. He has conquered the most difficult terrain in the known world by simply changing his perspective. The storm below continues to rage, but up here, everything is quiet and still. Rico asks Chase what their next goal is now that they have a city in the sky. Chase looks toward the red dot of Mars in the distance and gives a knowing smirk. The challenge of Venus is over, but the era of the floating colonies is just beginning. With a final wave to the camera, the feed cuts to a logo of the mission and the number 100. The camera pulls back further and further, showing the entire glowing planet of Venus cradling the tiny floating spark of life. Chase has survived the hell of the surface to claim the heaven of the clouds, proving that no world is truly unreachable.